a young man is coming out of the museum, and there's a dense fog. He's trying to find his way through this fog, and he has the impulse to call out the name Pan. So he calls out, "Io Pan," and the voice answers.
In the garden, on stones in a ring. Hush now and listen to feel the lenses. I walk the circle, not the line. The Norns guide me. Stars align, fates are weaving my life. The old gods dances with me, holding rights again. Through my eyes they see I become almond, anima breaks free. Animus awakes, they step with my feet. I feel the earth shake. Wisdom I ask for in thunder. I hear thought. I will live with honor and die without fear. I am the I walk the circle, not the line. The Norns guide me. Stars align, fates are weaving my life. The old gods call. The old gods I am the one in all. I hear the old gods call. My soul is eternal. Take me to Valhalla.
Welcome to the One Within All to the InnerVerse podcast. I'm your host, Chance, and I am once again inviting you to step through the veil of the surface level perspective of life and into the mythic mindset where symbols, synchronicities, and the sacred can be seen in every moment. What sets you apart, dear listener, is that by sharing this extended moment with me today, you are distinguished from the average person's shallow spirituality because you seek something deeper. The average religious mindset is defined by a belief in fabulously historicized allegories, monolithic moral mandates, things that may or may not be aligned with natural law, and a loss of essential awareness that no story can encompass. The whole truth can only be pointed to in the fullness of one's innermost self. And as a seeker of mysteries, perhaps you've realized that there's a divine distinction between doing what's right because you've been told by an authority versus going towards goodness for its own sake. Staying in touch with why Today, we have a tremendous opportunity to learn from the vast exploratory experience contained within a seeker's life well lived, as we are once again joined by the occult researcher, magical author, and polytheistic practitioner Christopher McIntosh. In past appearances on InnerVerse, Dr. McIntosh has discussed his book, Occult Germany, and the symbolism and deep esoteric currents behind his novel, Return of the Tetrad. Both of these were profound conversations that I recommend you check out if you haven't yet, but today's episode will certainly stand on its own merit, as we'll be exploring the themes and insights from his newest work, a philosophical autobiography titled The Call of the Old Gods, giving an overview of Christopher's journey to a pagan life path. This excellent book feels like an invocation wrapped in a memoir, a ritual recollection that traces the resurgence of a perennial and primordial tradition developed throughout his journey across Europe to New York and his eventual settling in Germany. In his writing, Christopher never demands your agreement with his views, yet all the while invites a recognition of something perhaps we've all felt stirring within us, the echoes of ancient memory triggered by natural landscapes we've only just entered for the first time, that somehow feel familiar, connections with ancestors that may not even relate to our genetic heritage, and the sense that our lives have been shaped and guided by forces we can only ever so vaguely feel at the time, yet in retrospect seem like the workings of fate. It's an awesome read that will have you engaged all throughout, and I can't wait to get into some of my favorite threads in this metaphysical tapestry. So check the show notes for links to Christopher's new book, his website, and for all the ways you can support InnerVerse. So let's get into it, everybody. Join me in extending a warm psychic welcome that transcends time and space to our illustrious guest, the man of the circle, scribe of the spiral, and he who walks in the gardens of the gods, Christopher McIntosh. Thanks for joining me again, and how are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I definitely couldn't pass up on an opportunity to distill some of the wisdom from such a great life. You know, I actually like to say when I go to determine whether or not I would take somebody's advice or their philosophy to heart, I always like to think, would I be happy trading lives with that person or having lived their life? And after reading your autobiography, I feel that I would have enjoyed the life that you've lived up to this point quite a lot. So I'm happy to receive.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed reading about my life. I've been very fortunate in a lot of ways. I've traveled very widely, both geographically and in terms of ideas and so on. As I explain in the book, it took me rather a long time to come to paganism. It's a very roundabout route, but this is where I ended up, and that's where I am now.
Happily so, I'll add. Yeah, it's a great journey that gets you there. It's like the whispers of that path were sprinkled throughout all these different, seemingly divergent places that you went to. But, you know, my favorite thing to start off with talking about was this story from the beginning of the book, your Hermetic Baptism. Can you recount that memory for us? Talk about the, retrospective significance of it?
Well, my very early years were spent in Oxford, where my father was a lecturer at the College of Christchurch. And Christchurch is a very old and very beautiful college with a large quadrangle, well, several quadrangles, but in the main quadrangle is a fountain, a pool with a fountain. And in the middle of the pool is a statue of Mercury or Hermes. Well, at the time, of course, I didn't know the significance of Hermes. I was only about 2 or 3 years old. But I was fascinated by the goldfish swimming in the pool. and I leaned a bit too far over the water and fell in. And my father had to pull me out. Well, I now like to think of that as my Hermetic Baptism. Because, of course, I now know what Mercury represents. I know what an important figure he is. One just has to think of the word hermetic, hermeticism, the hermetic tradition. So, looking back, I regard that somehow as a pointer towards my future path. So that's what I call my Hermetic Baptism.
I think that's so profound, especially because there was a point later in your life where you almost were baptized in a Christian tradition, but something, didn't quite feel right about it and you backed out. However, like many people's baptism in childhood, you'd actually already had one. It makes me think of the baptism of nous or mind described in the Corpus Hermeticum. Like there was some kind of, I don't know, it's like almost a prophetic accident. It's so interesting. Yes.
Well, actually, I was never baptized as a baby because both of my parents came from a nonconformist background where there is no infant baptism. You're baptized later on. Basically, you were baptized and confirmed when you reach an age where you can appreciate the significance of this ceremony. So I was never baptized as a baby, and my parents took the view that if I wanted to be baptized, I could decide when the time came. So when I got to the age where normally you would be baptized and confirmed, I really had. I wasn't sort of violently against it, but it just wasn't something that it just wasn't a step I wanted to take. So I was never baptized. But in baptism is something that, of course, has a special meaning in the Christian tradition because Christianity teaches that there's something called original sin, and we're all born sinful, and the baptism ceremony cleanses us in a way and protects us from sin. So that's the significance of it. But in paganism, there's no notion of original sin. There's no notion that you are born sinful. So that there's no need for a baptism. So there are rites of passage in the pagan religion, and these rites of passage are important. Like the rite of passage when you pass from boyhood into manhood, and there are rituals and ceremonies that go with that phase. Sometimes there's a trial of some sort, an ordeal of some sort to mark this step. Of course, with the female sex, there are ceremonies that go with the first menstruation. These rites of passage are important in life, and that's one of the things I think that's missing in the modern world. That these rites of passage have lost their importance.
It's a very important theme, though, because as somebody that grew up without any rites of passage in my culture, I was blessed enough to undergo certain trials by fire and water anyway, like given to me by the gods, I would say. And, there's distinct moments in my early adulthood where these type of rites of passage emerged, and I came through the other side a new person, reborn. And I
Really?
wanted to actually point out, it's my opinion that most of what constitutes Christian rites and ceremonies were previously existing initiatory practices that were kept behind closed doors of the mystery schools.
Yeah.
And when Christianity came along, it made public a lot of things that were previously held sacred and private. There's actually a lot of evidence for this, even within the Bible. The Eucharist, the sacrifice of bread and wine, that is the body and blood of the Savior. Well, if that's actually something that's in the Old Testament when Melchizedek gives this exact same ritual to Abraham. It's identical. Or how about baptism? You have many examples. I mean, a lot of the ancient authors were a little tight-lipped about what went on in the mystery schools, but there's a few places where it slipped through the cracks with baptism. The pagan mystery schools definitely used it, but not as original sin cleansing, but as a symbolic rite of death and rebirth, you could say.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give this quote from the early church father, Justin Martyr, who writes in his apology. This is translated from Latin, but he says, "The devils no sooner heard of this baptism spoken by the prophet, but they too set up their baptisms and made such as to go to their temples and officiate in their libations and meat offerings by first sprinkling themselves with water by way of lustration. And they have brought it to such a pass that the worshippers are washed from the head to foot before they approach the sacred place where their images are kept." And there's another example of this from William Reeves, an 18th century Anglican clergyman who translated De Baptismo by Tertullian. He wrote that such mock baptisms were set up by the contrivance of the devil in the Gentile world. We find not only asserted by Justin, but all the primitive writers, and particularly by Tertullian. In his translation of De Baptismo, he writes, "Certainly, at the Apollonian and Eleusinian games, they are dipped, and they presume to do this for the regeneration and for the forgiveness of their perjuries. Thus were men initiated into the mysteries of Eleusis, and he who initiated them was called Hydrocharis, the purifier of the Eleusinians." So, I think that it's very interesting that Christianity has actually appropriated things and then kind of like scrubbed the historical record as best it could to make it look like these were original to their system.
Yeah.
But not to bash on Christianity, right? Just that
No.
like, there's more universality in a positive sense between our traditions, and the distinctions are to be celebrated, but we're certainly not as different pagans and monotheists as we're led to believe.
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between the linear view of things that you get in monotheism and the secular or cyclical view in polytheism. This was something that came home to me when I was living in New York and attended a lecture by a rabbi. And he was talking about the difference between monotheism and polytheism. And he said, well, you know what the difference is? He said, in monotheism, human history goes in a straight line towards the second coming or the promised land or the last judgment or whatever. But it's always proceeding in a straight line, forward to some distant goal. Whereas in paganism, in the polytheistic religions, everything moves in a great circle. And when I heard that, I thought, well, I'm a man of the circle, not the straight line. So that was an important moment for me. And one of the problems with this linear thinking is that it's become transferred from the religious realm to the secular realm. So it's you find it in the cultural realm, in the realm of the arts. You find it in the realm of architecture, for example, where architects are not supposed to look back to traditional forms. They have to always be forward-looking and modern. You get it in the world of the visual arts, where again, artists they're not supposed to be inspired by the great works of the past. They're supposed to create works that are challenging and thought-provoking and so on, but always moving forward. So, in my view, this linear thinking has actually done a lot of damage. So that's one of the reasons why I became a pagan.
I couldn't agree with you more. And one of my favorite authors that talks about the circle of time is the mystic René Guénon. Are you familiar with him?
Yes. Yeah.
He has a work called The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. One of my favorites. And in that, he talks about how the Iron Age, or the Kali Yuga, is defined by humanity's insistence on quantitative or material thinking and losing track of the essence. And in a nutshell, very, very small nutshell, it's like the scientific paradigm believes that matter itself has qualities that emerge from the matter, kind of like saying your consciousness is made out of your brain somehow. But the qualitative worldview, the essential worldview, is that these essential qualities exist like a Platonic realm of forms that are condensed into material. So the quality creates the substance instead of the other way around. Now, when you're talking about the reign of quantity in the Kali Yuga, in the linear perspective that you have to be forward looking, this architecture and this modern art, because there's nothing new under the sun in the true circle, they have to delete all reference to nature and reality from their art until all you have is an abstraction divorced of any kind of real transcendent or resonant meaning. You know, it's like, it just hurts to look at that stuff. The brutalist architecture of communism, for example.
Yes, that's right. It means that in this linear mindset, you are always privileging the present over the past. So you're always looking back at the past, as it were, from a mountaintop, and looking down on it, back on the past and down on it. So everything is evaluated in terms of progress towards the present. So now if you do that, if you encourage people to think in that way, what you're going to do is you're going to erode the cultural memory, because why should people celebrate their traditions, their local traditions, if they're constantly being told, oh, well, that's all old-fashioned stuff that we have to leave behind. So the cultural memory becomes eroded. And all that you're left with is the global monoculture. So this is another reason. This is another reason why I'm a pagan, because one of the things about being a pagan is that it has a local dimension. You want to celebrate local traditions, local customs, mythology, legends, and so on.
A lot of scholars I really like, 18th century, 19th century comparative religious authors, even some in like theosophy and whatnot, they have a tendency towards syncretism that starts to kind of lose track of that cultural ground of place and of people that makes things significant. And this global monoculture is a version of that in the secular, that people in the age of quantity or the Kali Yuga, they mistake uniformity for unity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
But I think the unity, and why I will probably in this conversation allude to some similarities between paganism and monotheism, is I think the unity comes from not pure syncretism, but centrism, finding the inner meaning behind whatever the unique cultural dogma is. It doesn't get rid of the culture's place and people and their ground, but it's the common essence that our varied expressions of archetype are arising out of. So, uniformity is not unity, and it really hurts. The more society becomes this uniform thing, the more dead it feels.
Yeah, that's right.
So in terms of, your ritual practices, I would love to discuss some of the rebellion against this sort of current age that is encompassed by things that you currently like to do. My favorite was your carvings of the runes into those stones.
I made a circle of runes in our garden. It's a circle of flat stones with the runes inscribed on them. And it functions as an oracle because it's in a grove of rhododendron bushes. And the sun filters through the leaves of the bushes and falls on the stones. So I can sit there and look at the circle and observe how the sunlight will move over this or that stone, or a leaf will fall on one or the other, or perhaps an insect will crawl over one stone or the other. So it's constantly interacting with the natural environment, and giving me a message. I can sit there and receive a message in this way. So the runes they're very powerful. They're very simple shapes that really consist of just three types of line: a vertical line, left leaning, and right leaning. But by combining these lines in different patterns, you get a series of symbols, which each of which has a particular meaning. So I find it a very powerful system, and it's a bit of a mystery where the runes actually came from, because they arose around the 2nd century AD, 1st or 2nd century, and but they appear to have a commonality with other systems of divination, like for example the trigrams of the Chinese Bagua system. There's a Norwegian friend of mine who's done some research into this, and there's some quite astonishing parallels. So it makes one wonder whether there's perhaps a common source for the Bagua system and the runes. So anyway, that's one of the features in our garden. What else can I tell you about it?
Well, the runes are an area of unexplored interest for me. I personally do lots of divination. The Western Tarot is a very useful system for me. The I Ching I've used even longer. It was my first introduction to divination. And I like to mix it up and use multiple systems together, because I think when you do that, there's even deeper layers of synchronicity. If you're using just one system, you can get a profound message, but you overlap 2 or 3 systems and all 3 tell you something that's basically the same idea, unique to how it expresses in that system, then you really have some seriously hard-hitting divine message. But I'm not as well versed in the runes, and I thought it was interesting, and I'm forgetting her name, but there was a friend that you talked about in your book, The Call of the Old Gods, who was seemingly one of the most important researchers and authors about runes to help bring that system back to life in the modern world.
Yes. I got to know her when we were both neighbors in London. We were living just 5 minutes walk from each other. And she was living in a house where there was...
and pardon me, what was her name again?
Well, the name she uses now is Freya Eswin. At that time, she was called Ellie. And she lived in this house where there was a ritual group that used to meet, which I was part of for a time. And during that period, she became interested in the runes and the whole Nordic tradition, and came to the conclusion that that was really her path. So, and then she wrote a book called Leaves of Yggdrasil. It's a very, very good book about the runes. And she's now quite well known worldwide, translated into many languages. And she's now quite famous as an expert on the runes and the Nordic tradition. So that was really my first introduction to that tradition, although I didn't really become an active participant in it until later in my life. But I also practice a kind of runic yoga. It is called Stav. It's a system that was developed by a Norwegian man, Ivar Hafskjord, and it involves a series of body positions, like yoga or Tai Chi. So I practice this every day, and I find it very beneficial.
So these postures like Qigong or Tai Chi are inspired by runes instead of animals as they are in the Chinese system?
Yes. They're basically, you basically put your body into the position of one rune or the other, and you go through the whole series. And it's also a martial arts system. I've done some martial arts training with it, but I don't do the martial arts bit now. Just the yoga part. But there are martial arts positions that are based on the runes, and they're also very effective.
I'm really intrigued by this Stav system. I remember this in the book, but making your body reflect runic shapes.
Yeah,
it's fascinating because most people's relationship to divination is intellectual and spiritual, but this is an embodiment of it. I wonder how that impacts your connection to the system on the other two levels.
Yeah, I guess each rune puts you into a different mode, as it were. Basically, all I can say is that when I do the series of positions, I find it extremely beneficial. It centers you in a certain way, and it improves your posture and your whole kind of frame of mind as you start the day. So as I say, I find it very beneficial.
So I imagine people could find out about this by looking up Stav, S-T-A-V.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
And maybe adding runic yoga to that. But is there a particular resource you're aware of where people could learn more or initiate into this?
Well, yes, the man who developed it, Ivar Hafskjord, he has a school, a sort of training center. If it's still going, it's sometime since I looked at the information about it. But then, if you simply Google Stav, you should get through it fairly quickly.
Okay, well, I think people are wise enough to find that, but it's definitely interesting. That's a very cool thread. Yeah. Another question, since we're talking about runes, do you think that this is a system that is going to be resonant to anybody, even outside of Astartu, a Norse paganism? Is this something you recommend people explore more deeply, even in other practices?
Yes, and I think it could. I think it would be beneficial to anybody.
And the runes themselves is like a divinatory system beyond just this yoga.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, each one has each one is a magical symbol, and it has a different divinatory meaning.
Okay, so another area that I'd like to explore is the concept of initiation by scholarship, because you've been, straddling the line between academic and initiate practitioner for most of your life, it seems. And, I'm wondering if study itself has served as an initiation for you at different times in life. Because it's a very common thread in our modern culture that we're not really involved with actual mystery schools, but we're, like, people listening to us right now are exploring these things in kind of an isolated, self-directed, autodidactic way.
Yes. Scholarship has been a very, very important path for me, and well, a lot of people who study, shall we say, that the history of a particular esoteric or spiritual tradition go out of their way to be very arm's length about it, and treat it as though they were looking at it in a laboratory, not getting personally involved in it. I've always, well, let me put it this way: there are times when it's appropriate to wear a scholar's hat and say, well, I have to obey the rules of scholarship. That's to say, not make unwarranted statements, not manipulate the evidence, don't use doubtful sources. Be careful about the sources you use, and give your sources. If you do all that, then it's fine. So I've never really seen a conflict between being a scholar and being a participant, although it in a way they call for a different sort of approach. But scholarship was an important way in for me. My first sort of introduction to this whole area was through astrology, and my first book that I wrote was when I was in my early 20s was a history of astrology. And through writing that book, I came into contact with the whole wider esoteric tradition of the West. So I wouldn't have got into these things if I hadn't felt a personal attraction to them. So scholarship was an important. It was part of the path that I was following, and I was doing these researches at a time when to be researching these things was a great adventure, because we didn't have the internet. So sometimes if I wanted to look at a rare book, I could go to the British Museum, British Library, or I could go to various bookshops. It was always an adventure going to these bookshops, like Watkins Bookshop in London or the Atlantis Bookshop. It was always a sense of adventure, because you never knew what you were going to find. You might find some treasure on a back shelf of a bookshop. So that there were times when I even traveled to foreign countries to look at books or manuscripts. So nowadays I don't have to do that. Most of the time I can just go into the internet and call up a PDF of some quite rare manuscript that I would have had to travel to France or Germany to look at. So having been mainly looking at these things as a scholar and researcher, I gradually developed more and more of a personal involvement in these things. And for a time, I was attracted to the tradition of the Golden Dawn and Golden Dawn type of magic, which I was practicing for a time with the group in London that I mentioned. And I found that that was a very rewarding experience. But then over time, for various reasons, I became more and more attracted to paganism and the pagan path, and particularly the Nordic path, because that is basically the path of my ancestral roots. So, I mean, I describe in the book the various stages that led me to this. One was being at the Frankfurt Book Fair and meeting an old friend from London days called Frederick Lamond, who had been in the Wicca movement for most of his life, the neo-witchcraft movement. And he had written a book called Religion Without Beliefs, about paganism and about his own particular path. And I read this book, and that was really what finally convinced me that was the path for me. Meeting Fred at the Frankfurt Book Fair was one of those coincidences which have happened to me that led me to follow the path that I have.
I am excited about many different points of what you just spoke on. There's a lot to pull on through all of that. So we kind of talked about this last time, how the internet is such a different feeling for research than having to go to a library, but that maybe there's something even more deeply synchronicity inviting about the way you used to research versus how things work now. And I remember in the book, there was actually a certain point where you were researching Rosicrucianism, and you were basically invited to look at this rare manuscript you'd never heard of that ended up becoming a cornerstone of your thesis. And this all happened in the, out there real world, not online through search engines. What was that manuscript? And can you talk more about how that related to the thesis you were writing?
Oh yeah, well, I was in Austria with my then wife doing research for the thesis, and one day we were in Innsbruck, and I called in at the library of the Tyrolean State Library, and I'd been given the name of a particular professor at the University of Innsbruck, and I called him up from the library, and he happened to be in his office when I called. So I said, could I come and see you and talk to you about my thesis? So he said, yes, by all means. So I went to see him and told him about the thesis that I was writing, which was about a Rosicrucian order called the Goldman Rosary Cross. And he said, oh, well, you need to go to the Hague in Holland, to the Masonic library there, because they have a very important collection called the Kloss collection of books and manuscripts. And there's a lot in that collection relating to the order that you're writing about. So then a few months later, I went to The Hague and I went to that library, and so it turned out to be crucial for my thesis, because there were manuscripts in there. There was, for example, a correspondence between two men, one of whom was a sort of a Rosicrucian Grand Master, and the other was a younger man who was going to be initiated into the order. And so there are descriptions in this correspondence of what it involved to be a member of this order. So that was very, very crucial for me. And I never would have found out about it if I hadn't been talking to this professor in Innsbruck. So that's just one example.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Freemasonry path that you also embarked on at different points in your life.
Yes.
And when Freemasonry gets brought up in podcasts that are interested in philosophy and truth, for some reason there's this persistent notion that they're some kind of boogeyman, secret, evil organization, right?
Yeah.
which I think is quite absurd when you really just do a little bit of reading into what Freemasonry is about, by their own words. Of course, all organizations have the whole spectrum of human beings as a part of them. Nothing in this world is all good or all bad, but to label them as such is kind of silly. And I wondered what you thought about that in context to your own experiences as a Mason.
Well, Freemasonry is a good example of something universal. You see, you were talking earlier about the universal versus the local. Well, Freemasonry is something universal. It's the ceremonies are, well, they vary. They vary from one lodge to another. But if you go into a lodge, if you go into a regular Masonic lodge anywhere in the world, the ritual will be more or less familiar to you. So this is one of the reasons why I value Freemasonry, because it gives you that universal dimension, whereas the pagan way gives you the local dimension. Yes, and as for the sort of sensational things that are said about Freemasonry, as you say, it's largely nonsense. Well, people talk about the secrecy. They say that meetings take place behind closed doors, but so many things take place behind closed doors. I mean, practically every company board meeting in the world takes place behind closed doors, and what goes on in a board meeting is confidential. So there's nothing particularly sinister about the closed doors or about the secrecy.
Well, that actually brings up a really interesting point to ask you about, in the sense that you've had a relationship with academia for your whole life. And you've been actually, in my opinion, involved with a rather open-minded elements of academia when it comes to occult and esoteric topics. But there's a book I really value called Philosophy Between the Lines by an author named Arthur Messler. And he talks about the history of esotericism as an integral part of the Western literary canon. And then he contrasts that with a lot of the last 100 to 150 years of academia rejecting esotericism's existence, as if we're meant to read the authors of antiquity purely for surface value. And he goes on to try to help instruct the reader on different techniques to read things from an esoteric lens. One of the arguments that he makes is that our modern society has become deeply distrustful of esotericism because of various developments that we've experienced culturally. Just in the nature of how we communicate, people in westernized nations value direct communication, whereas in less, you could say civilized, but I'd say like less westernized societies and a lot of Eastern civilization, even into the Arabic world, they value indirect communication. They value they value not coming right out and saying it, but kind of dancing around their point and inviting the listener to infer. It kind of makes their speech more poetic. It makes their conversation more of a dance, and it gives you leeway to say some things that might not be approved of, but you can get away with it because you're not exactly saying it outright. And there's so much to this that it's even in certain handbooks of international organizations about, if you're in this country, they're going to speak indirectly to you. If you're in this country, it's going to be a direct form of communication. We have this idea of our society that we're seeking some kind of empirical truth. There's this scientific materialism that drives that, an Enlightenment era sort of mentality that has permeated even into philosophy and positivism and things of that nature. So that when the modern scholar, especially in the United States, encounters esotericism, they're outright likely to reject the notion entirely, because how could this well-respected, famous, important author have been practicing this duplicitous method of communication? Doesn't that kind of invalidate their whole position in the rank of canonical importance, right? And there's so much more to it. I'm just kind of giving a really rough summary. But I think that that's part of the milieu culturally that has led to this deep distrust of organizations like Freemasonry and other, magical societies. But there's many reasons why esotericism as a literary device is not just important, but it's valuable to the initiation process. And I wondered if you could, I have more questions than this, but I said a lot, so maybe you could just share your thoughts before we move forward from there.
Well, I've come up against the attitudes that you're talking about, this extreme sort of positivist attitude that rejects anything to do with esotericism. When my thesis was published as a book, The Rose Cross and the Age of Reason, it was reviewed by a famous Oxford historian, and he said that, of course, Rosicrucianism is a symptom of minds adrift from their moorings. Minds adrift from their moorings. So I thought, oh dear, apparently I've got a mind adrift from its moorings. And so I thought, well, that's very disrespectful, because you can study those Rosicrucians from a scholarly point of view, but it doesn't mean you have to regard them as people with minds adrift from their moorings. You can have respect for what they were doing, if you see what I mean. And if you take that very disrespectful attitude, then it's going to blind you to certain things. There's certain sort of aspects of what they were doing that you're going to miss if you treat them that way. But I think that is changing a bit. Esotericism is becoming more accepted these days as a subject for study. There are a number of universities now which have courses in the history of esotericism.
I would even go so far as to say esotericism is the very reason why many of the philosophers of antiquity have remained alive in our culture, because you don't have there's not one meaning to extract from a text. It's a meaning that resonates to the current reality and place in life and time to the reader, which means it's an endless well of potential wisdom and insight that is only available and accessible through resonance with your own internal self, right?
Yes.
It makes it so much more valuable, but it doesn't make it easy to extract the esoteric information from a text. And there's no way to actually pin the ultimate meaning on an author either. that writes this way.
Right.
I'm wondering, I want to give a few other reasons why esotericism existed. Of course, there's like defensive esotericism to protect the author from getting stoned or burned at the stake. There's protective esotericism that actually insulates a society from the social unrest that would result if the deep truth that was meant became widespread and well known.
Yeah.
Because as Plato's Republic illustrates, you need several noble lies to keep a large civilization in order with itself. And if those lies were exposed and the truth was revealed, I think there's a lot about our current society that if certain things were more well known about how governments function, particularly on a global level, there would be unrest. Things would fall apart, right? We actually, if we want to go to the grocery store and get all of the food that we like to get from all the different places it's coming to us from, we kind of need a large majority of the people to believe a bunch of lies. Unfortunately, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but that's kind of the case, right? As a lifelong scholar of philosophy and esoteric texts, do you have any insights for how somebody can approach their reading with a lens to read between the lines? Maybe advice for getting past the surface level of things.
Yeah, I would have to think about that a bit. The path one follows in this area is such a really personal thing. In my case, I was led. I talk in the book about my life being like one of those pictures made up of dots. And when you join the dots up, you get an image, and how I'm tempted to join up certain dots. But if I'd ended up in a different place, I would have gone back and joined up a different set of dots. So, as I say, my own particular path, it started with astrology, and then it went on to magic, Rosicrucianism, and so on. That was my particular path. If somebody's coming completely fresh to this whole area, I would suggest reading some rather general books that would give them an introduction. One quite good book. It's a very popular book, but it is quite good. Colin Wilson's book, The Occult. That gives gives you a kind of general bird's eye view of the whole area. So I would start with some book like that, and perhaps even join some organization. Some organization that has some general program that would provide people with an overview of the field, and then they can go on to explore whichever aspect attracts them.
If I was to synthesize what you are saying here, along with what your book really has to say between its lines, I think it would be, there isn't a right way to read esoterically. And probably the most tried and true method is to simply connect the dots that you see as being joinable. And that's going to be different for different people, but that's what's going to help you extract knowledge from inside yourself, which is what these really profound texts that are almost initiatory in value are able to do. It's not a dogma. It's a mirror to your soul. And so don't read it from the perspective of a student at university trying to get the right answers on the test. Read it from the perspective of like a synchromysticism, where you connect the lines that you see as connecting, and then that shows you a pattern that exists within yourself, And that gets you closer to knowing yourself as an individuated soul.
Yeah. Well, one author that I like very much is Diane Fortune. As you probably know, she was she founded an order called the Fraternity of the Inner Light, which was practicing a kind of Golden Dawn magic. And but she wrote a series of novels, and I find her novels extremely good. They're extremely gripping and inspiring. Novels like The Goatfoot God, The Sea Priestess, The Winged Bull. I would recommend these as a way of getting a glimpse of what the esoteric is all about.
Hey there, fellow acolytes of ancient Gnosis. You've reached the point in the podcast where we normally end for free listeners. But stick around, because this time, the extended episode is on the house. That's because I'd like to celebrate the launch of InnerVerse Plus on Substack by letting you sample the vibe of a full show. And if you enjoy getting more than double the content, head down to the episode description to find links to the platforms where you can become an InnerVerse supporter and unlock the huge archive of extended shows. InnerVerse Plus is available on Patreon, where the vault extends back to the earliest days of the podcast. Unlocking this treasure trove of high-vibing knowledge only costs $8 a month. And I'll assure you, there's more to listen to here than most people could ever finish. You can also find extended episodes via the YouTube channel membership option, which is a great way for people who like to stay on YouTube to get this content. And last but not least, the InnerVerse Substack is officially live. I'm absolutely loving the high-quality functionality of this platform, and if you join me here, you can expect classic extended episodes to be added every day until it's caught up with the other channels. And the best news, channel supporters now have access to a brand new podcast, Inner Circle. Join me each week as I bring you up to speed on things I've learned from biofield tuning, herbalism studies, podcast research, and life in general. This is where I finally get to share the things that just don't fit in an interview-style podcast. The Inner Circle is where we can connect more fully, and I'll be responding to listener questions and topics every week with this new audio-only podcast. InnerVerse isn't just about opening your third ear and expanding your imagination of how epic life can truly be. It's a positive vibe that's infectious and life-changing. And if you want more of it, join me across this tiny paywall to bring more resonance to your residence here on the earthly incarnation. We'll return to the conversation with Dr. Christopher McIntosh in just a moment, but before we do, I'd also like to let you know about the other ways you can support InnerVerse. Head over to InnerVersePodcast.com and check out the huge catalog of episodes you might have missed, where each is a timeless classic that will hit you with synchronicity no matter how long ago it might have first aired. While you're there, find the Sound Healing page, where you can book a one-on-one biofield tuning session with me. These remote healing ceremonies are not your garden variety energy work. They're more like psychic acupuncture, where I guide you to where your mind is limiting your body and life, and we release belief-based blocks to open up flow and potential that can benefit you in almost any area of your existence. The webpage for this service provides tons of free information that you can use to help yourself understand the messages your body is sending you. So if you've never checked out the page, I encourage you to go. InnerVerse is also supported by Tippecanoe Herbs, in my opinion, the world's best holistic herbal medicine. And I'd love for you to try them out using the coupon code InnerVerse for 10% off your order. Or drop into the episode description to find my affiliate link with Lotus Way and pick up some incredible flower essence elixirs and aromatic sprays to augment your frequency with powerful positive energy. In a world where materialism has made idols out of illusions, knowing the gods as a guide to the inner and outer archetypes of this mental cosmos puts you far ahead of the Kali Yuga's curve. Whether you prefer one divine being or several, your attention is your connection to the creator of all. Thanks for spending some of it here, and enjoy the rest of this talk with Dr. McIntosh. One of the fun parts of your book is how you talk about the London of the day and age when you lived there, and walking in the footsteps of characters like Dion Fortune.
Yes.
Alpheus Levi, Aleister Crowley. I even recall there was a reference in there to one of Fortune's books.
Yes.
I think it's The Unfortunate. His Dark Materials, is that right?
No. That's the Winged Bull, which starts off in the courtyard of the British Museum, the front courtyard, where a young man is coming out of the museum, and there's a dense fog. So what they used to call a pea super in London, and he's trying to find his way through this fog, and he has the impulse to call out the name Pan. So he calls out "Io Pan," and a voice answers, and it turns out that it's his former commanding officer from the army, who turns out to be a sort of adept, and takes him under his wing and takes him into a magical order. So that's a very atmospheric beginning to a novel. Now, of course, I've walked across that courtyard many times.
I can't help but wonder if you could describe more of the feeling of that time and place. You know, the novel example you just gave, it almost gives the feeling of like a place where the veil is thin, that this fog is actually a type of doorway, you know?
Yes.
Did you ever feel these kind of doorways opening around you in, like, you know, dark alleys or as you crossed the city?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, it was a very exciting time. London was really the ideal place for me to be at that time, around the late 60s, late 60s and 70s and into the 80s, because London was very different in those days. It had what I would describe as a kind of Dickensian quality. It was parts of London were rather sort of grey and slightly melancholy, but in a nice dreamy sort of way. So you'd be going down some back street in London, and you come across a dusty bookshop where you might find some treasure for next to nothing. So there was this feeling of London being a place with, as you say, portals and into another reality. And the occult bookshop is a kind of literary trope, because one of Diane Fortune's novels involves a young man going into such a bookshop and being led on a whole kind of esoteric journey through his contact with the bookseller. And there's a novel by Edward Bulwer Zanoni, which starts off in such a bookshop. The bookshop in his novel is actually based on a real bookshop that existed in Covent Garden. So these bookshops have been sort of portals for me, bookshops and libraries. And it was an exciting time, because the esoteric was just opening up. Because when I was young, when I was a schoolboy, one wasn't really aware of these things, because there were almost no esoteric bookshops. There were almost no esoteric or New Age magazines, and I'd never heard of the Theosophical Society or any of these things. So it was only later on when I moved to London that I became aware of this burgeoning interest in the esoteric. And I remember there was a particular series of conferences. There was a woman called Marion Green who ran an esoteric magazine called Quest. And there was an annual Quest conference in London where speakers, well-known speakers from this area, came to lecture. Colin Wilson, for example, came, and my friend Frederick Lamond and other people like that. So there's a feeling of things opening up, and in academe, very little going on, but there was, for example, Francis Yates at the Warburg Institute in London was one of the few academic places where these subjects were being researched into. And Francis Yates was at the Warburg Institute, and she was just coming out with books like Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, investigating these traditions in a serious way, and just beginning to be taken seriously by the academic community. So that was a very exciting time to be in London and researching into these things.
You actually were there and witnessed the emergence of what's now called the New Age movement.
Yes.
Which is fascinating, and I might want to pull on that thread a little more. But
Really?
I want to make sure we devote some time to talking about the gods on a deeper level. And one of the things that was also emergent in your time and place back then was the type of Jungian Hillman-esque psychology that was transcendental psychology, you could say, looking at cosmic forces that express through us and to us, both in our psyche and in the soul of the world itself, through synchronicity, through events, through symbolic patterning. There's so much to that. But, so I want to layer the stage with that whole system as well. But I want to talk first about your friend, Frederick Lamond, because you tell this, you cite a story that he writes about of a type of initiation via Eros, right? Where he had a sexual encounter that actually transferred his consciousness to a level of existence where he became all men.
Yes.
And he was, in intercourse with all women, almost like an experience of being the god with the goddess. And I'll be honest, I've actually been there before. It's a place you can go. Usually you don't go there on purpose, but it's a real part of our existence. I think that there's something. What is that? How do you comprehend that part of consciousness being something that's accessible, albeit not necessarily often accessed by most people?
Yeah, well, the use of sexuality as a means of transcendence is something that you get in many traditions, in many spiritual traditions. You don't get it in Christianity, except in a sort of sublimated way, and that's another of the reasons why I'm pagan, because it is a means of transcendence. And I found that story of Fred Lamond very moving, because he had this love experience with this Belgian woman that he'd fallen in love with, and it just blew his mind. He had this sort of cosmic vision of this goddess energy, and afterwards he wanted to celebrate it. He started to think about, well, how can I celebrate this? Because there didn't seem to be any place for it in the kind of religious environment that he'd been brought up in. So he started to look around, and then he discovered the witchcraft, the Wicca movement of Gerald Gardner, which was started around the 1940s or 50s. And as he put it, this was the only game in town for him, because in Wicca you have a god and a goddess, and so the goddess is in fact the more important one. So at that time, it was a tiny movement. It was just a very small group of people around Gerald Gardner, the coven that he had. And Fred made his way to this coven and was initiated into it. And that was his path from then on. He describes very movingly the initiation ceremony into this coven. So his book is very, I found it very, very moving, and his account of what paganism is and what it has to offer. As I said, that's what really tipped me in favor of going down that particular path.
What I want to explore is, what does it possibly mean that these transcendental states of consciousness are accessible? That, I'll preface it with a possibility. I could see the almost universality of mythological traditions and religious traditions having a doctrine of emanations, a source, light, or being from which levels of differentiation, multiplicity, and separation ripple outwards like concentric circles. So you have the pleromic singularity in the center, and then maybe you have a first circle of God and goddess, or maybe even the first circle is the first one individuated mind out of that, pleroma. And then that becomes 2, and then that maybe becomes 4, 8, 12, and so on and so forth, to the level that humankind are a very distant circle from this central unity, emanating from the central unity. From that idea, it would suggest that pantheons are a emanation that is actually just in aggregate and encompassing of separated aspects of a single unified source. St. Augustine of Hippo, one of my favorite things to cite is how in his book, City of God, I think it's book 11, maybe. People will have to look that up. He actually talks about this, where he's giving his argument for Christianity, and he puts it in the terminology that, well, hey, we're not saying that all your gods don't exist. We're saying that Jove is all of those gods. And that wouldn't it be smarter, instead of, worshiping and honoring the gods that you do, but maybe leaving some parts of Jove out because you forgot about the god of the bathroom or something? Shouldn't you just worship the one God that encompasses all of them? It's like less risky that way. You don't miss any parts of God. And it's a really funny, from a modern sense type of apology, because it demonstrates that early Christianity, as the one of my favorite authors, the Reverend Robert Taylor, says, early Christianity is about as different from paganism as 6 and half a dozen. It wasn't until, many iterations of dogma for the sake of possibly social control, that sexual repression to separate and gatekeep the experience of transcendent states, things of that nature, those built up over time. But at the beginning, it was just a sort of new and more public version of a mystery tradition, in my opinion. And that Augustine quote from City of God really demonstrates it, that he doesn't even rule out the existence of these many, many gods. He goes through and names like as many as he can think of. It's 2 pages of him naming gods and saying they're all part of Jove. So I think that's so profound. And so why I'm bringing this up is maybe the secret of the gods is that, and God is that they aren't really separate. They're 2 ways of looking at the same thing, and maybe how you access the divine as a singularity or as a certain part is something that informs us magically. You have these different distinct parts as a way to, as in ritual magic, connect with a particular outcome or expression that you want to access. So I think these transcendental sexual experiences people can have where they become the god or goddess can kind of give you an experiential gnosis that you actually are on this spectrum of concentric circles of emanation from one singular life, that there is only one life in existence, but it's just a matter of where you're at upon its sphere, you could say.
Yeah. Well, in a way, the Indians have the same idea as Augustine, because they believe that there's one supreme God, but under him there are many deities, and so you can worship Krishna or
I like Agni, the ram, the fire god. That's a good one.
Yes, or Indra, or any of the other Shiva, any of the other Indian deities, that as you wish. But so there's no contradiction really. You could see all this multiplicity of gods as kind of different faces of supreme God, or you could see them as personifications of forces, or whatever. But I think where I wouldn't go down the Augustine path is because it's because I think it's important to have an actual ritual practice. If you go too far down the monotheistic path, what you're going to end up with is a uniform liturgy, which the church then tries to impose on everyone. So you've got the mass, which is more or less the same throughout the world. Whereas, as I was saying earlier, there's an important local aspect to paganism.
That's actually what pagan even means. It's pagus, Latin for a country.
Yes, a country dweller, yes.
Yeah. A rustic.
Yeah, a rustic, yeah. But also, pagans basically don't fight over religion. They may fight over other things like territory or whatever, resources, but not over religion, because they don't need to fight over religion. So when the Romans invaded other countries, they didn't try to convert the inhabitants to the Roman pantheon. They just said, well, we worship Mercury, for example. People in Northern Europe worship Odin, who's similar to Mercury. So there they call him Odin, we call him Mercury. So there was no need for any conflict.
In fact, what they tried to do was convert the local gods to them. Instead of the people to their gods, they would try to convert the gods of the city they wanted to conquer to be on the Roman side.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was one of the kind of more interesting military strategies that the ancient Romans had.
Yes. Well, yes, so there was a certain amount of conversion that went on. But
they would actually make supplications to the local gods of the place they were trying to conquer, as if to convince them that they were the more worthy people to support. So they didn't dismiss their rivals' gods whatsoever. They actually tried to sort of steal them.
All right. Yes. No, well, yes. So there was a bit of that, but basically, it's basically the pagans don't they don't fight wars. They don't fight large scale wars like we've had in Europe, 30 Years' War, for example. People sometimes say, well, we all worship the same God, but the trouble is that people who are monotheists have different ideas about who that God is and what he wants of us. And so they end up by saying, well, my one God is my God and doesn't tolerate any others. See what I mean?
You know what this also makes me think of, Christopher, is I keep thinking of my favorite Jung text, which is the 7 Sermons to the Dead. He really explores this in a Gnostic way, where he talks about the nature of the pleroma, which would be the all that is, that you could consider the source, the center of the emanations of all the else of reality. And he describes it as being everything combined with its opposite. And so in this very like Zen koan type of way, his philosophy, which I think is quite sound, logically speaking, is that this pleroma, this everythingness, is not really very distinct from nothingness, because all things with their opposites, it's sort of like a nullifying. And when you look at how monotheistic cultures tend to develop over the course of our many hundreds of years of experience now, there is almost like a nullification or nihilism that seems to kind of dwell deep in the heart of some of these civilizations. You can look at that as original sin, that you're damned as soon as you're born. That's a very nihilistic type of perspective. Or just simply that the uniformity is actually something that is quite like stripping of essence and meaning in the Guanan sense, like we talked about before.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, I kind of resonate with that, I think it's all well and good to see the source unity of all things, but also the, when, in the Jungian sense, if that's all that you respect or revere, it kind of becomes denuded of meaning. Yeah. Because it's just this sort of amorphous oneness, right? Yeah, and then all you're identifying with essentially is power, because power is the only thing that is not negated by its opposite, according to Jung. Yeah. So, and that's the nature of the pleroma, is just pure effectiveness or pure power. And then you have what comes out of that is all these like might makes right type of civilizational developments. Yeah.
That's right. You mentioned James Hillman earlier. He's very interesting.
I want to talk about Hilmar too, though.
Oh, Hilmar, yes.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Well, James Hillman's very interesting because he's definitely a sort of pagan. I think that side of his work doesn't get talked about very much because it goes against the mainstream of psychology. But he talks. There's one book of his called Revisioning Psychology, where he argues that paganism is basically a much better way of looking at the human mind than monotheism is, because human beings are many people under one roof, as it were. So if you have a polytheistic view, you can see them in terms of different deities. Yeah, so he makes a very interesting argument for paganism, and I find it interesting the way there's a number of other people who have in the field of psychology and philosophy who've come around to the pagan view. And another one is the French philosopher Alain de Benoit, who he also makes a very good case for paganism.
In a way, you could even say that Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, also makes this case. He has this whole thesis, if I'm not mistaken, about, his idea that prehistoric humanity did not experience their thoughts as their own. They did not self-identify with their thoughts. And although that seems like such a radical notion, we think our thinking is ourself. Most of the different psychological or mindfulness or spiritual type of techniques that one can use to sort of heal their own trauma and internal division has to do with disassociating from identifying with every old thought that comes up. And in the Janes view, it was that Julian Jaynes thought that the early humans might have experienced or might have perceived their thoughts as actually coming from different entities depending on the nature of the thought, and thereby developed the idea of a pantheon, and that they're being spoken to in their mind, and that they identified simply with like the observer or witness of it. And again, that seems so foreign, but it also is like kind of radically sensible to look at your thinking that way.
Yes. Well, there are many different ways of regarding the gods. Some people would see them as constructions, really, things that we construct as personifications of forces in ourselves or in the world. Other people would regard them as actual existing entities with a consciousness. Yeah. So in a way, it doesn't matter how you regard them. I would tend to regard them as personifications of forces that have actually taken on a kind of dynamic. You could call them egregores, actually. An egregore being a thought form on the invisible plane, created by many people thinking the same thoughts and focusing on the same ideas and symbols. So I think I see the gods as egregores that started as personifications of forces, but then actually through people worshipping them over time, they've taken on a kind of dynamic and energy of their own, which then feeds back to humanity.
Can you talk about how these thought form egregore gods maybe speak to us? You know, in your experience, what are some moments or types of experiences that make you feel like you're connected to a particular god or receiving guidance or a message or protection?
Well, I can't say that I've had any very dramatic encounters with the deities. It's more a sort of a sense of from time to time, a sense of a presence. I do feel that there are certain intelligences, you could say, that have guided me in some way. I mean, one of your questions had to do with synchronicity and coincidence. Well, I find that in my life there have been certain coincidences which have been meaningful to me. You mentioned Hilmer, my friend Hilmer Hilmerson. Well, I got to know him back in London around the same time that I got to know Claire Eastwood, and I visited him a few times in Iceland. And at one point I lost touch with him, and I didn't know where he was. And it was after I moved to Germany. I was working for an institute in Hamburg, an institute of UNESCO. And at one point I attended a conference in Copenhagen. And at the end of the conference, I was walking through Copenhagen looking for somewhere to have supper. I stopped in front of a restaurant, and I was looking at the menu, and suddenly Hilmer appeared in the doorway. And I said, "Good Lord, this is extraordinary." He said, "No, it isn't. We always meet like this." Because there'd been another occasion when I was in London and traveling on a bus through London, and I suddenly had the impulse to go to a particular cafe in Soho. And which I did. I walked in, and there he was sitting there. So it was twice that happened, and twice in the cafe. So that's synchronicity, you could say, coincidence.
One of my favorite lines in your book is where you write, "Coincidence is the universe thinking aloud." And I do see synchronicity as the grammar structure of divine communication. And it's not, you give one example of you're looking up something about owls, I believe.
Oh yeah, yes. I was at my computer in our living room, and I was looking for a particular motif for a sculpture, and at the same time, my wife Donata was watching a quiz show on television, and the there was a woman contestant, and the quizmaster at one point asked her, "What is your favorite animal?" And she said, "An owl." And at that very moment, an owl appeared on the screen of my computer. So, well, if that's not synchronicity, I don't know what is.
So those kind of very personal, in your own head synchronicities, to me, you mentioned that there are some who would say that's the first sign of madness. Yet those type of synchronicities are even though they're subjective as in only you can prove it, they're objectively there in your own, in your own stream of thought. It happens to me all the time. I'll have headphones on, earbuds in. I'm listening to a podcast. They will say some kind of very specific word or phrase that is not a common phrase. And at exactly that moment, those words will just appear in the environment as I walk by or drive by, or somebody near me will say that exact word at the same time. It's actually constantly happening. And I think it's happening way more than we notice. And it's just about the attentiveness to see it. And for me, what I believe is most healthy that we can learn from that is our connection, the reflectivity between our inner and outer world.
Yeah.
Because that allows us to shift from, which is definitely kind of a monotheistic perspective, that the world is imposed on us from the outside.
Yeah.
You were born sinful to your inner world is actually the director of the outer world.
Yeah.
You're like, you become, you have a book about the Northern traditions, and the pole star is so important to Northern traditions, right? And how, because it's so visible there, and it's this still center point. And pretty much all pagan systems have, or religions of the ancient world would work with these would create sacred centers, whether it was the maypole in the village square or it was a temple that was designed in almost like a zodiacal expression with like a center point of the nave and things of that nature. Stonehenge is a big circle, right? I think the journey of initiation is to reclaim our place as a mobile, center of the cosmos, wherever we are, right? It's not solipsistic. It's not egotistic. It's actually, everyone is their own sacred center. It doesn't take away from somebody else's. But when you can live life that way, the synchronicity, I think, swirls and spirals around you much more readily. You hear the gods. You have to be in the center. That's where they're at, if you want to see them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's important to have these centers, as you say. But unfortunately, they're becoming rarer in the modern world. It all has to do with what I was saying about the local. I mean, we are as human beings, we are rooted in a particular place, either because we were born there and grew up there, or because we've chosen to put down our roots there. So we're linked to a particular place, and that's what I talked about in my book when I talked about the various parts of us that need to be satisfied by a spiritual path, and one of them is the feet or the ground on which we stand, and everything that goes with it. That is to say, the nature, the culture, the traditions, the folklore, the language, the mythology, the music, the songs, the architecture, all of that, everything that goes to make that particular place special. And so this is for me part of being a pagan, and so it's important to have places where you feel contact with the spirit or the spirits of that place, like sacred trees, sacred springs, maybe standing stones, whatever, and one can actually create these places. So I'm trying to create here what I call a garden of the mysteries, where I've invoked basically various types of mystery, the mysteries of ancient Greece and Rome, and the Hermetic mysteries, and the Celtic and Nordic mysteries of the North. So that's my own little bit of sacred space.
I think the Garden of the Gods that you've built and rebuilt in your life is one of the most sort of satisfying parts of the book, especially because we didn't even mention that you have great photography of things in the book. And man, there's so much in there that we haven't even talked about. You've lived a life that has fascinating levels of connection to people that have wound up being quite important, actually, to this whole story of the reemergence of the sacred.
Yes.
But I want to, there's one thing I want to make sure we talk about, because, and I didn't throw it at you in the email earlier, but it just came up since I've been thinking this morning, how repeatedly you've referenced in the book the workings of the Norns, the Nordic version of the Fates. And I want to talk about them, but I'll let you talk about them first, your relationship to them, who they are, what they are, particularly from the Astartu tradition.
Right. Yeah, well, the Norns, as you say, the goddesses of time and fate. And my runic circle is actually dedicated to the Norns, and there's a stone bench at one side of the circle which has an inscription in German which says "To the Norns," and the three Norns are Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, and stand for past, present, and future. Urd is the past, and Urd determines the present and the future. So, to some extent, the future Norn, Skuld, is often depicted half veiled. So she can see part of the future, but she can't see it all. So, in other words, there's another concept in the Nordic tradition called weird, which
philologically the same word as Urd.
It is, yes, yeah, and so this weird is sort of a pattern that is within you, and partly determines the course of your life. So you have to act in accordance with the weird, but it doesn't completely determine the course of your life. It influences it. So that's why the Norn Skuld is only half half veiled, not completely veiled. So she can see part of the future, but not all the future. So what this means is you have certain areas of your life that you can't change. You're born with certain qualities, certain abilities, and so on. And maybe certain advantages and disadvantages that you can't change. So the thing is to accept the things that you can't change, but in the other areas where you're free to make changes, there you have the opportunity to shape your life. So this is really the way I see the runes, and the Norns. Sorry, so I can sit on this bench dedicated to the Norns and look at the runes and be guided by them.
It's a nice bridge between determinism and free will. I think that the truth is in the middle of that, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about the Fates or the Norns, and I know you're a multilingual man, more so even than me. I'm more of a philological, etymological researcher, so I don't necessarily speak other languages, but the beauty of philology is that once you understand relationships between different alphabets, you can start to recognize words in other languages for how they're actually the same word as in English, but just with some letter swaps. So the Norns are called the Fates. Now, if you go back to the ancient Celtic priesthood, they had multiple classes, the three classes of priests, you could call them. And one of them were called the Vates or the Ovates. And the Vates means they were seers or prophets. They're kind of like bards but they're not like just fortune tellers. They basically sing the song of the weird or the pattern. You could consider them as like a root idea to the Fates, being that they don't they declare the already ordained law of the cycle or the circle. They're revealing what the first cause had ordained to happen in a cycle. And this was very in tune with astrology because they were reading this fate from the star scripture in a lot of senses. There's other types of omens that they would read as well. But in etymology, the letters V, B, P, and F have a lot of crossover. They are all called labial consonants because they're produced using the lips. You see this in ancient Greek. The beta changed from the sound of a B to the sound of a V. The Hebrew bet can also interchange in that way. The Hebrew letter Pe is a P or an F, depending on context. There's tons of examples of this. So when you look at Vates in the philology lens and start interchanging those letters, you get Vates, Fates or Fates, Pates, which is basically Patres, the fathers, or Badres, which is basically just a little rearrange it and you have bards. I think this even connects us, to the Vedas or the Edda. I think the Edda and the Vedas, like just that sort of wording for the sacred scriptures all points to what I think, and it's not something I've proven yet, but I actually think that the ancient Celtic peoples were the ones that taught the Easterners what became Buddhism way back in the day. I think that they're the original spreaders of what was universal about this system. The holy sailors, you could call them. So like this word, fate, it comes from this idea of Vates who were poets in a sense.
Yeah.
And what I love about that is when you really study scripture in an anagogical way, a lot of the divine revelation you receive, and this is part of reading things esoterically, comes from poetic interpretation of what you're reading, what they call the green language, right?
Yes, yes.
Hearing things in a word or in a phrasing that are not necessarily the surface level meaning, but it's also there in a certain point of view. I think that this is a big part of how the gods actually speak to us.
Yeah, that's right. Mm. Yeah, because there's a question as to whether basically our language and our civilization came originally from India, or whether as you're suggesting, it came from an area further west, or maybe from the far north, as some people would say.
That is one of those great unanswered questions. But I will say, if modern people share tendencies or behaviors with their ancestors, the European folks are the ones that do more of the spreading of culture globally than other cultures. So just from that little piece of evidence, to me, it makes more sense that the similarities and cultural diffusion between East and West, and even all the way into South America, where the ancient peoples of modern day Mexico had everything from a flood mythology to a crucified savior figure before being destroyed by the Spaniards. I think it makes more sense that those ancient priest, Mason mariners would have been of European origin. And that's pretty taboo to say these days, because they're the one culture you're not supposed to celebrate for whatever reason. Get called a Nazi.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great unending mystery, right? The mystery is part of the fun. I think it's supposed to be.
Yes. Yes.
So is there anything we've left on the table, Christopher, that you wanted to tell people about in your book, or just ideas that have arisen that we haven't finished off in a satisfying way?
Well, one person that would like to mention who was an influence on me, and that was the Scottish poet Ian Hamilton Finlay, poet and artist, whom I talked about in the book. And he was quite a remarkable person. He wasn't particularly esoteric, but he was a sort of pagan, although he probably wouldn't have called himself that. But he had started off as an avant-garde poet. I was aware of him when I was growing up in Edinburgh, because he was very much sort of part of the avant-garde scene there. But at some point he became a traditionalist, and he created a wonderful garden in the Pentland Hills near Edinburgh, which was filled with what he called image poems. So little poems set on carved in steles, and references to the classical gods, and it was just a wonderful place. So I became very friendly with him. I was a close friend of his for about 30 years. And he had dedicated what he called he dedicated his garden to Apollo, basically. Well, he was involved in a whole struggle with the local authority, because he refused to pay local taxes on what he called an Apollo temple in the grounds that he had there. But anyway, he had a big influence on me, because it was he who really turned me on to gardening and the use of gardens in a symbolic way. And he also really taught me something about tradition, namely that tradition is not like a chain weighs you down, but it's something it's a set of lessons from the past that guide you in the present. So, and this is something that has been an influence on me throughout my life, ever since I've known him. So I wanted to mention him as well, as I pay tribute to him in the book.
I thought it was poignant how when considering writing sort of his story, you questioned whether or not he would want you to do that.
Yes, yes. So there's a little book that I wrote about him called Ian Hamilton Finley, a memoir, which I actually we actually published it, my wife and I, through our little publishing imprint that we have. So if anybody's interested, that's available on Amazon. Ian Hamilton Finley, a memoir.
Yeah, and I just remember how profound it was, the moment where you decided to sort of in a prayer type sense connect with him on a spiritual level after he'd passed.
Yes,
and
yes.
You felt like you got a response.
Yes, I felt I got a message from him saying, well, if anybody can write a memoir about me, it's you.
I truly believe that we have the ability to make that type of contact with our loved ones beyond the veil whenever we wish. And I think we actually do that with people who are alive more often than we realize. Everyone has had the experience of having a sort of being at odds with somebody you know and mentally circling through almost like an argument with them. Like they would say this, but then I would say that, and you're kind of like fighting with them psychically. Well, I think that just in the same way that those back and forths almost emerge organically in your mind when you're in a conflict situation, you can create that type of communication with somebody you know, living or dead, on a positive level. And I think you can even resolve conflicts that way that seem difficult to resolve in person by first approaching it on a psychic plane and making peace that way, so that when you come to them in person next, you're already in a posture of reconciliation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you could even do that with deceased people.
Yes. I think that's absolutely a power and ability that we all have. And it can bring a lot of peace to the feeling of bereavement, to know that you can still talk to them anytime. Yes,
absolutely.
So Christopher, is there anything next for you on the writing agenda?
Yes, I'm writing a book about Prague at the moment, because Prague is a city that's been an important place for me over the years. It's a very unique place. It's a very magical city with a very, very rich esoteric tradition. It's a place where I have certain personal contacts, and so I decided to write a book about Prague, having written Occult Russia and Occult Germany. I'm now writing Occult Prague, or Mysterious Prague.
Well, I greatly look forward to that, especially with what I know about the sort of secret history of Bohemia as a haven for alchemists.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
In Prague especially. I think there'll be lots of fun revelations in that work. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
It's been quite a pleasure getting another chance to have a conversation with you, and I'll definitely be on the lookout. Are you publishing with Inner Traditions again for your Occult Prague?
Yes, Inner Traditions, yeah.
What they are a great imprint, and definitely watch out for the publication date.
Good.
And thank you for your time this evening. It's been another very pleasant chat. I appreciate it a lot.
You're most welcome. Been a pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you, Christopher. We'll catch up later.
Yeah.